The news.
Hello, I'm Daniel Frankel. The United States has been struck by a series of terrorist attacks, with 4 hijacked passenger planes crashing into key buildings in New York and Washington. There's still uncertainty about the number of victims. Thousands of people are feared dead. President George W. Bush has said the perpetrators will be caught and punished. U.S. troops all over the world have been put on the highest state of alert. Worst hit in the attacks was the World Trade Center in New York. The building's twin towers were struck by 2 planes, and both have now completely collapsed. A third building has also since collapsed. In Washington, part of the Pentagon, the home of the Defense Department, has been laid waste after a plane crashed into the building. The fire is still burning out of control, and hundreds of people are missing. A 4th aircraft crashed in the state of Pennsylvania, about 150 kilometers from the city of Pittsburgh. Immediately after the attack on the Pentagon, the White House and all other government buildings in Washington were evacuated. A state of emergency has been declared in the U.S. Capitol, San Francisco, and several other cities. President George W. Bush has traveled to a command center at an air base in Nebraska. The hijacked planes were Boeing 757 and 767 aircraft and had at least 280 passengers on board. Given the scale and precise nature of the attacks, this would appear to have been a coordinated terror operation against the United States. The international community has responded with horror to the attacks on the United States. Russian President Vladimir Putin conveyed his condolences to the victims of what he's called this terrible tragedy. German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder spoke of a declaration of war on the civilized world. British Prime Minister Tony Blair expressed his shock and promised the United States every help in hunting down those who carried out the attacks. The Israeli government expressed itself in similar terms. The European Union announced it was shocked and saddened by the events in New York and Washington. In an initial reaction, NATO said it would form a united front against international terrorism. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called for a resolute battle against terrorism. NATO's headquarters in Brussels and Mons has been put on full alert. Governments all over the world are meeting in emergency session, and extra security measures are being taken. U.S. embassies in many Western countries are being guarded with extra vigilance. Israel has closed down all its embassies as a precautionary measure. Groups in the Middle East and Asia who are known for their anti-U.S. views have been denying involvement with the attacks in New York and Washington. The Palestinian terrorist movements Hamas and Islamic Jihad have both stated they were not involved in any way. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat fiercely denounced the attacks. Even the strict Taliban regime in Afghanistan immediately condemned them. The Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, a well-known enemy of the United States, has condemned the attack and said his country was prepared to send help to the American people. Iraq called the attack the reward for U.S. crimes against humanity. Experts believe the attacks could be the work of Saudi-born terrorist leader Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, a billionaire Muslim fundamentalist, is currently living in hiding in Afghanistan. He's also held responsible for the 2 bomb attacks on U.S. embassies in East Africa a few years ago. He is said to have warned recently that an unparalleled attack on U.S. targets would soon take place in retaliation for U.S. support for Israel. And reports are coming in from CNN television that the Afghan capital Kabul has been hit by rockets and explosions. The U.S. Defense Department has denied they are in revenge for the earlier attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Despite the denial, experts and commentators are pointing out that the Saudi-born terrorist Osama bin Laden is living in Afghanistan and may be behind the attacks in the U.S. The opposition in Afghanistan may be behind the attacks in Kabul, but no one has claimed responsibility as yet. The attacks in the United States had an almost immediate impact on the world's financial markets. Prices on European stock markets plummeted, with Frankfurt down 8.6%, Paris down by 7.4%, and London down by 5.7%. The Frankfurt Exchange was evacuated after a bomb threat, and the London Exchange was evacuated as a precaution. On currency markets, the dollar dropped sharply against the euro, the Japanese yen, and the Swiss franc. The price of crude oil shot up by almost $4, closing at $29.40. At the end of European trading, the price of gold bullion was up by nearly 6%. Trading at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was halted temporarily. New York's Stock Exchange on Wall Street, not far from the twin-towered World Trade Center, remained closed throughout the day and will not be open on Wednesday. And finally, the Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok has called on the United States for a restrained response to the attacks in New York and Washington. Mr. Kok was speaking after an emergency meeting of the Dutch cabinet. The Prime Minister said it was crucial for the U.S. government to keep a cool head, but he added that it was easy for someone to say that when so far away from the United States. He voiced his deep shock at what he called the indescribable catastrophe that has struck New York and Washington. That was a bulletin of international news. And now, back to Pero de Jong.
Although there have been many attacks on U.S. installations abroad, it's rarely been hit at home. There's been nothing like this since the bombing of Pearl Harbor. For television viewers around the world, the initial reaction to the crashing of 2 planes into the World Trade Center buildings in New York was stunned disbelief. But on the streets of New York, it was shock and panic.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows.
I looked up, and that's when I heard the explosion. That's when the second tower came down. Again, whoever was left on the street started stampeding. I'm in the office. Right now, I'm in the main building of Pace University. People are crying. They have gas masks on their face. Authorities are making people go toward the basement. They're just doing anything that they can to move people away from the financial district.
Now, as the real extent of the damage and likely loss of life begin to register, questions are being asked. The big ones are, who did this and how many lives have they claimed? We're joined now by our correspondent in New York, Reinoud van Wachtendonk. Reinoud, in the disaster area itself, are rescue operations underway?
They are still going on. It's still quite chaotic what is going on the southern tip of Manhattan. New York hospitals are reporting that they are overwhelmed with injured people. There are triage sections set up, at times not even in the first aid and emergency departments, but outside. There are urgent calls for blood donors on New York TV and radio stations, and apparently people are listening, people are lining up, giving blood.
Is it still too early to say anything about casualties?
It is too early to give firm numbers about that, but the mayor of New York City and the police commissioner of New York City have prepared the people in New York to expect catastrophic numbers of fatal casualties. The World Trade Towers themselves, during a regular workday, which this was, house about 50,000 people. These World Trade Towers have collapsed. The attack happened just before official office hours. It was the morning rush hour, so maybe not all these 50,000 people were in the building, but still, if you add it all up, you are going to talk about hundreds, if not thousands, of people who may have perished in this.
And what are the authorities doing to reassure, at least to give information to families and relatives?
There's not that much being done. That is one of the sub-stories with this story. A lot of people in and around New York City, commuter towns all over the place, do not really know if the persons that left this morning to go to work will come back. Some of them, of course, and most of them undoubtedly will come back much later than usual, because connections with the island of Manhattan, bridges and tunnels are closed off. There also will be people, though, who will have died, and it is incredibly difficult to get contact by telephone or even cell phone with people in New York City. So there is an enormous amount of uncertainty. Tens of thousands of people now do not know 100% where the people that they said goodbye to this morning are.
And uncertainty, how close is that to panic? Are there still fears that more attacks could be undertaken?
I don't know if people realistically expect that there will be more attacks. It is so that United States Air Force fighters are patrolling the skies over New York, the coastal areas. A couple of aircraft carriers have left their ports on the east coast and are steaming up north. Their airplanes are patrolling. The only aircraft that are in the skies of the United States are military aircraft, because all civil aviation has been shut down and will stay shut down at least till noontime, the United States next day.
Okay, thank you very much, Reinoud van Wachtendonk. The prime suspect is the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden. Some news services are reporting that the Muslim extremist warned 3 weeks ago that he and his followers would carry out an attack on the US. Our Middle East editor is Bertus Hendricks. I asked him if bin Laden is indeed the best guess.
Well, I think the word "the best guess" is appropriate here. Of course, we do not know who is behind it at this moment. And the Oklahoma precedent has made us aware that sometimes you jump to conclusions too soon, and then it turns out to be something completely different. But in this case, I'm inclined to prefer the bin Laden hypothesis because the whole modus operandi, the kind of sophistication, the kind of network, the kind of financing you need are so huge that you need an organization with the financial capabilities and the network links that bin Laden, as far as we know it, apparently has. What we know mainly from Western intelligence services, and we know from a number of trials where people, especially for the embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, were brought to trial, and from dissidents from his organization. And what we know from this, we know that he has a very extensive network, not only in the Arab world, but in the wider Islamic world at large. And that his networks are active in Kashmir, they were active in Kosovo and Bosnia before, in the Philippines with Abu Sayyaf group, and in the Arab world. So a whole, I would say, number of indications seem to point to him as a likely responsible for this action.
Now, there were also rumors that he had, in fact, hinted that he was planning a major attack on the United States. What do we know about that?
Well, he has made it very clear that he considers the United States, or the Crusaders, as he calls them, the West in general, a legitimate target. And of course, this will only have increased after the Americans tried to eliminate him with a bombing raid on his supposed hideout in Afghanistan after the embassy killings in Tanzania and in Kenya. And there are the editor-in-chief of the Al-Quds newspaper in London has said on record that very good source had told him 3 weeks ago that something was in the works. So this also reinforces this thing. The bitter irony, of course, is that bin Laden initially came to prominence with close support from the CIA, from the Saudi government, from the Egyptian government, from the Pakistani government and their secret services in the struggle against the godless communism of the Soviet Union, which was the occupying power in the 80s of Afghanistan.
But what exactly is his grudge against the United States?
Well, I think we have to do here with a general feeling in the Islamic world, at least in those extreme circles, who feel that Islam is being discriminated against, that there is a kind of crusade, and that's the word that he uses, against the Islamic world, that the West is biased and that it is the Americans who are leading this crusade against the Islamic world, and that it is the duty of the true believers to conduct a jihad, a holy war of self-defense as they see it, and to strike the big Satan in the heart, and the little Satan, which is then Israel, also if they can.
The little Satan, Israel. There was speculation earlier that it might be a Palestinian group that has claimed responsibility, but is there a strong link to the momentum of what's been going on in the Middle East?
Well, in the Islamic world at large, and especially in the age of satellite television, daily broadcasts of the sufferings as they see it of the Palestinian people, and the fact that as they see it, the West is doing nothing but is really giving the green light to Israel to continue its occupation, all this is feeding into a kind of unease in the Islamic world, and it is this kind of unease and bitterness that again provides, I think, the fertile ground in which some extremists are being recruited into networks of Osama bin Laden, who want to get a unification of the whole Muslim world, not only the Arab world, but the whole Muslim world in their fight against what they call the Crusaders and the Jews.
Now, if it is bin Laden, would it be his style to claim responsibility for the attack?
Leaving things in the dark, I think, could serve his immediate answer, because he knows that the pressure to do something about this on the United States is tremendous. This cannot be left unanswered. And already I think the Taliban regime, which has given him the hideout for many years and may still continue to do so, this regime has distanced itself and said we have nothing to do with it. If only in order not to embarrass his Afghani hosts, if they still are his hosts, I think would plead for not saying openly what he did, in the knowledge that if he is indeed behind it, his people will know and will readily assume that he is.
That's our Middle East editor, Bertus Hendricks. America's European allies have reacted with horror to what has happened. In fact, there were concerns that NATO headquarters in Brussels might also be on the list of targets. European ministers are meeting on Wednesday to discuss how what's happened changes more or less everything. I've been hearing more about Europe's reaction from our correspondent in Brussels, Peter Veenendaal.
Shock is almost an understatement for the reactions here in Europe. There is what you might call a sense of crisis, a feeling that things will never be the same in the whole Western world after today's incredible events. Also a feeling of shared grief, enormous sympathy, solidarity with the people of the United States, who after all share the same democratic and social values. All European heads of state and government have condemned these attacks in the strongest possible words, and so did the leadership of the European Union tonight upon its return from a summit meeting in Yalta. This is what the acting president of the Union said, Belgian Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt.
I want to express, in name of the European Union, our entire solidarity with the United States, with our American friends, and with the American people, with our allies. And also our solidarity with all the victims and the families of the victims who live and who have lived in pitiable hours today, and certainly also in the next days.
So, feelings of crisis, feelings of solidarity, but how do those feelings translate into facts?
Well, the feeling of crisis is illustrated by emergency meetings of national governments, extreme security measures all over the continent, and a practical standstill of public life. Everybody in Europe has been glued to the television screens, hardly able to comprehend the extent of these terrorist acts. The foreign ministers of the 15 EU countries will attend a crisis meeting tomorrow, and so will all European commissioners to, as they say, evaluate and analyze the security situation. 3 of them will travel to Washington as soon as possible. Extensive consultations are already underway. Verhofstadt has already called President Bush. Europe will offer its American ally all the help it can possibly muster, first of all, of course, in the hunt for those responsible and in the global fight against terrorism, and if needed, specialist help in the aftermath of this disaster. What's clear, anyway, is that Europe feels just as involved, just as wounded by these attacks as the United States.
Now, Brussels, of course, is also the headquarters of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What has been its reaction to what's happened?
Well, the attacks are seen, or at least felt, as an act of war against the member states of the North Atlantic Alliance. That prompted an emergency meeting of the NATO ambassadors. And after that meeting, Secretary General Lord Robertson said that those responsible for the attacks will not get away with it. And he offered the alliance's closest cooperation with the Americans.
It underscores the urgency of intensifying the battle against terrorism, a battle that the NATO countries, indeed all civilized nations, must win. All allies stand united in their determination to combat this scourge. At this critical moment, the United States can rely on its 18 allies in North America and Europe for both assistance and for support. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you.
Lord Robertson. And he also said that possible military action in retaliation for the attacks had not been discussed. Meanwhile, all the non-essential staff has been evacuated for the time being from NATO's headquarters in Brussels as a precautionary measure.
Brussels correspondent Peter Veenendaal. Dutch politicians have added their voices to the chorus of reactions expressing profound shock about what has happened. They all agree that this was not just an attack on a single country, but on a whole system of values rooted as deeply here as in the US. Our reporter Hans Andringa has been collecting reactions from Holland's main political leaders, starting with Prime Minister Wim Kok, who warned against reacting too harshly.
Well, it's extremely difficult to find the right words. We have to continue to defend values of democracy and human rights, even in times when others who don't respect human rights have used the worst, the most extreme possible weapons and instruments. That's the lesson perhaps we have to learn from this. Don't repeat what others did.
Mr. Melkert, you're the leader of the Social Democratic Party in the Netherlands. What was your first reaction when you saw the news today on television?
It is an attack straight into the heart of the democratic world. It implies for the democratic world, United States, Europe, other democratic countries, that there is an enormous task to counter this attack in an appropriate way, and at the same time to avoid escalation by violence.
Are there any consequences for the Netherlands?
I think the Netherlands are in complete solidarity with the United States. The Netherlands will play their role in the European Union consultations to try to formulate its position in the coming days, and I'm sure that our governments will do their utmost.
Mr. Obseffer, you are the leader of the Christian Democrats in Dutch Parliament. In what kind of situation have we landed now after the assaults in the United States?
The Statue of Liberty was watching Twin Towers. Twin Towers do not exist anymore. So the first reaction, of course, is sympathy. Big sympathy for that country, which has probably lost thousands of its citizens.
Mr. Dijkstra, leader of the Liberals, is this an attack on Western democracy?
Well, at least it's an attack on all the values that in every modern democratic state, which is based on the principles of justice. So in that respect, it's an attack on all of us.
If we try to look in the minds of the people who did it, what did they want to achieve?
I consider it completely impossible, as far as I'm concerned, to look into the minds of people who do this. Absolutely impossible.
No, for me it's unimaginable, but at the same time it happens. So we have to think of an answer to those actions, and there also is a responsibility for the international community. I think the European Union, NATO, the United Nations, it's also a matter of all those international boards. So I really hope that the international community will work together in giving here the proper answer.
That's Liberal leader Hans Dijkstra expressing some of the shock felt here in the Netherlands as well. Ever since the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, terrorism experts have been speculating what form a possible new strike against the United States might take. But did they and could they predict what happened today? I put that question to terrorism expert Marianne van Leeuwen from the Klingendaal Institute on International Relations here in the Netherlands.
Frankly, I think so. Both the Pentagon and the World Trade Center are symbols of American power in the world, so that as far as the target selection is concerned, those would be fairly obvious targets. The use of airplanes as a sort of weapon. Well, we have, of course, had the history of hijackings. In the 70s, there were a lot of extra measures on airfields, security measures, in connection with these hijackings, so that what we saw in the 80s was that hijacking went out of fashion for terrorists, so to speak. There has been a certain relaxation of airport security, and but as far as the hijacking of an aeroplane is concerned, this has happened before also.
But then still the overall question is, the United States is very much afraid of terrorism. Why has this been able to happen on such a scale?
I think because the American society is a democratic society, and Americans would not tolerate a police state, and the only way in which you could prevent any type of terrorist attacks, and even then you would really succeed, would be to have really draconic security measures to close airspace over major cities, and measures like that, which would really lame social life, and that's impossible.
So you would say that, generally speaking, America's handling of terrorism and terrorism prevention is as good as it can be expected?
Perhaps the American policymakers, maybe also security service, are not altogether prepared to dive into the mind of their opponents. It's very hard to believe that somebody really hates your guts, and it's very hard to distinguish when the moment comes when your opponents are really willing to put the deed to the word and to do what they say, that they will hit you wherever they can. But there are many people and organizations, of course, out there who do have a grudge against the United States. They are, after all, the sole remaining superpower, and they have a lot of friends, but they also have a lot of enemies, especially in the Islamic world. I don't always get the impression that Americans really get into the heart of radical Islamic movements and understand the ticking of these people. You could say, well, if you understand, what does it help? Maybe it helps you to trace them earlier.
Marianne van Leeuwen of the Dutch Klingendaal Institute. To recap, in case you've just tuned in, the United States has been struck by a series of terrorist attacks targeting principally New York and Washington. We don't know how many people have been killed or injured, possibly thousands. The attacks began in New York, where 2 airplanes crashed into the World Trade Center at the beginning of the business day. Shortly after, another plane was flown into the Pentagon. The main suspect is the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden, who's also believed to have been behind the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. We leave you now with the reaction of U.S. President George W. Bush.
I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Newsline will continue with its coverage of the events today in the United States and their aftermath, with a bulletin coming up in an hour's time at 1 o'clock UTC. Stay tuned now for Music 5215 coming up, and then in a half an hour's time at midnight 30 UTC, it's time for Stories of Our Century, where Jonathan Gruber looks at what it was like to be a Jew in Nazi-occupied Holland through the eyes of a young Jewish girl who hid from the Nazis with her family in an Amsterdam attic for 2 years. Of course, her name was Anne Frank, and her diary of that period has become world famous. That's on Stories of Our Century. As a reminder, you're listening to the Dutch International Service, Radio Netherlands. We're broadcasting via shortwave, satellite, and the Internet. On shortwave, we're broadcasting to eastern and central parts of North America on 6165 kilohertz in the 49-meter band and 9845 kilohertz in the 31-meter band. We're also in Europe on the Astra 1G satellite, digital transponder 109, and then search for RNW1.
Music 5215. Music from the world at large. Presented by Martha Hawley.
Every year, the town of Nijmegen in the Netherlands hosts a festival which is known as the Music Meeting. And they gather talent from all over the globe for Dutch audiences. The November 2000 event was the 16th edition of the Music Meeting, and today, Music 5215 brings you a review. A number of ensembles were present there, including the Black Sea Orchestra, with musicians from Bulgaria, Greece, Russia, Moldavia, Ukraine, Romania, Georgia, and Turkey. And in fact, this ambitious project was launched in Turkey back in 1996 by Mr. Okay Temiz. The musicians in his group have varied histories. They include the clarinet of Ivo Papasov, which is the music for Bulgarian weddings, I'm told. Guitar player Enver Ismailov was named Musician of the Year in Ukraine back in 1995. The Romanian Harry Tavitian started on the classical piano circuit at age 10, but he eventually opted for free jazz after hearing a concert by bluesman Memphis Slim. All of this is in the Black Sea Orchestra.